Stories are really powerful, like this one. On May 25, 2020, the world bore witness to a tragedy that shook the foundations of justice and humanity. George Floyd, an African-American man, lay defenceless on the asphalt of a Minneapolis street, the weight of a white police officer's knee pressing mercilessly against his neck. For 9 excruciating minutes, Floyd's desperate pleas for air reverberated, his haunting cry of "I can't breathe" echoing across continents, piercing the hearts of millions. In the aftermath of Floyd's senseless and brutal death, the global community found itself standing at a crossroads, confronted with the stark realities of systemic racism and police brutality. From the depths of despair emerged a glimmer of hope: the Black Lives Matter movement. In a display of unparalleled unity, people from every corner of the globe united in grief and outrage, demanding justice and equality for Black lives. Fast forward to 2021 and Derek Chauvin, the officer accountable for Floyd's death, faced the reckoning of justice. Convicted on charges of murder and manslaughter, his trial marked a watershed moment in the ongoing struggle against racial injustice, a testament to the power of collective action and unwavering determination in the face of systemic oppression. However, amidst the resounding chorus of support for Black Lives Matter, discordant voices of dissent arose, seeking to diminish the urgency of the movement's message. The mantra of all lives matter permeated the protest, a thinly veiled attempt to divert attention away from the specific injustices experienced by Black communities. At first glance, the sentiment behind all lives matter appears noble, an invocation of inclusivity and unity. Yet, upon closer examination, it reveals a dangerous disregard for the unique struggles endured by people of colour. It's a form of whitewashing, a willful denial of the deep-rooted inequalities in our society. To assert that all lives matter is to dismiss the centuries of oppression and discrimination experienced by marginalised communities, to turn a blind eye to the insidious effects of systemic racism. It's a shield wielded by those unwilling to confront their own privilege, a manifestation of the very biases and prejudices that precipitated Floyd's untimely death. The truth is stark and unyielding. The phrase "all lives matter" serves as a defence mechanism, a barrier erected to shield individuals from the uncomfortable truths of their complicity in perpetuating injustice. It's a stark reminder of the arduous journey that lies ahead in the fight for equality, a journey fraught with obstacles and challenges, yet illuminated by the unwavering resolve of those committed to effecting lasting change. The dark events that unfolded on the streets of Minneapolis, where George Floyd's tragic death served as a global wake-up call, another poignant chapter in the fight against racial injustice was written, this time in the heart of Australia. The Collingwood AFL Club, a revered institution in my country's sporting landscape, found itself thrust into the spotlight when a comprehensive report uncovered systemic racism entrenched within its very core. Researched and written by the esteemed duo of distinguished Professor Larissa Behrendt and Professor Lyndon Coombs, the report embarked on an exhaustive journey into the depths of Collingwood's policies and practices. Its aim? To shine a light on historical injustices and chart a course towards a future characterised by inclusivity and equality. In the wake of this revelatory report, Behrendt and Coombs lauded Collingwood's courage in confronting uncomfortable truths head-on, likening the club's introspection to holding up a mirror to itself. In a display of humility and accountability, 150 active players penned a heartfelt letter of apology, expressing profound shock and shame at the revelations unearthed. The resignation of club president Eddie Maguire underscored Collingwood's commitment to swift, and decisive action, signalling a seismic shift towards accountability and change. While the journey towards racial equality is an ongoing odyssey, Collingwood's response shows that there is hope amidst the shadows of systemic injustice. There is a transformative power in the vulnerability and honesty of self-reflection, showing that true progress can only be achieved through a steadfast commitment to confront biases and dismantle entrenched prejudices. In the face of adversity, Collingwood chose courage over complacency, setting a powerful precedent for others to emulate. By embracing vulnerability and fostering a culture of inclusivity, the club has charted a course towards a more just and equitable future for everyone. As the world continues to grapple with the complexities of race and privilege, Collingwood's Journey serves as a poignant reminder that progress is not only possible but imperative. By confronting biases head-on and fostering a culture of accountability, the systems of oppression that have plagued our society can slowly be dismantled. Bring the story closer to home. The heat sat like a wet blanket across my shoulders. As I stepped out of the plane, I could smell the ocean, but it was overladen with that pungent smell of jet fuel. No wonder. I could see that the airport runway ran out into the Pacific Ocean at both ends. After catching the red-eye flight from Brisbane, bouncing down into Honiara in the Solomon Islands to refuel, I was stepping out into my very first day of 4 weeks on Naru with the latest cohort of Salvation Army workers, officers and volunteers who were going to work for 28 days in the newly reopened Offshore Processing Centre on Nauru, run in conjunction between the Australian government and the Nauruan government. What I didn't realise as I took those first few steps into the heat was that this 28 days was going to be transformative, full of things unexpected, and that took a long time for me to reflect on and explain. After spending a full day in orientation, the last thing that we did on that first day on the island, before we could go home to our quarters and have a shower and relax, was to go down into the camp, see where we'd be working for the next 4 weeks. We were taking in small groups. We had a leader who led us through the chainmail fence, past the security guards and down between the rows of Green Army tents. I could see there were lots of men around. I came to understand there was about 400 men in the camp. They were sitting on stretcher beds, plastic chairs. Some of them were smoking, some talking, many just sitting around looking into space. As I looked through the camp with the group that I was with, I noticed that my body was responding in a way that was unusual for me. My stomach was churning, my shoulders were tensing. And I really didn't understand why, because I was in my mid-50s, I'd experienced quite a bit of life, and I was confronted with a very unusual situation. And I didn't really know why I was responding the way I was. Over the next couple of weeks, I thought over what was happening, and I realised for the first time in my life, really, my body was telling me that I was afraid. And as I gave that some more thought, I thought, well, what am I afraid of? Because I realised I didn't have any need to be physically afraid. The men who were in the camp were traumatised. They'd fled persecution, then been transferred quite quickly from where they thought they were safe to this little island that they knew nothing about. There were security guards everywhere. There was chainmail fence. I didn't have any need to be physically afraid or afraid for my physical safety. What I came to realise was that I was Afraid because these men were different to me. White skin, men had various shades of brown and black. I only speak English. I could hear all these languages around me that I didn't understand. Languages I came to understand were Arabic and Persian, Urdu, Pashto, Tamil. And I knew that most of the men came from Muslim countries. And I'd been raised in a Christian environment, Christian home, and I was working for a Christian organisation. So different to me. Here I was, an Australian, and these men came from Afghanistan and Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Iran, Iraq, and in some cases, places in Africa. And as I then thought through, well, gosh, why do their difference make me afraid? I realised that although my family were not overtly racist, I'd been raised in a very white environment. Everybody looked like me, sounded like me, thought like me. And somewhere along the line, I'd picked up the idea that difference was a threat. If you were different to me, then you weren't someone to be trusted. After that first 4 weeks, I went back to my work with the Salvation Army in Canberra, was asked to return for another 3 weeks, and it was during that time that I realised that I needed to be working on Naru full time, and so I asked the Salvation Army hierarchy for a change of appointment, and in June of 2013 I went back as the Religious Liaison Officer. Now it was my job to look after the religious needs of all the asylum seekers. So that meant whether they were Hindu or Christian, whether they were Catholic or Protestant, Buddhist, Zoroastrian, Muslim, it didn't matter. It was my responsibility to make sure that their religious needs were met, because we realised that if we looked after their religious needs, their mental health was likely to be stronger. And it was during this time that I also started to notice how the white expats on the island, so there were people from Australia and New Zealand, the UK and the US, how we, and I say we because I recognised it in myself, how we were treating the Naruans who were on our teams. There was this sense of being dismissive, this sense of superiority, an idea that, well, hello, come from a first world country, this is a third world country, I'm university educated, a lot of these people don't have much more than a high school education. Of course we know better. And I sat down with Fatima, who headed up the Nauruan team for the Salvation Army, and talked about what I had observed. And her answer floored me. She said, "Oh, we know that about you guys, but we just accept it." So here was Fatima reflecting back to me what I had noticed. So it was real and I had to own it. And of course, then I came across the term white privilege and white superiority for this first time. So as I confronted what I realised was a latent racist bias and my own white privilege, I realised that I could either continue on that journey or I could change how I viewed the world. And I made a conscious choice to, rather than see difference as a threat, to see it as an asset. And then in my role as the Religious Liaison Officer, so because I was having that mindset, I could so much more readily listen to, appreciate and learn from people who were so very different to me. As we move through this video, I will share with you 4 aspects of leadership which I've observed are key for women who know that deep in their souls there's another way to lead. Because as women understand the powerful truth that what has been deemed weakness is actually powerful strength, then together we can create the worlds we've been dreaming of. As I reflected on those first few days in Nauru, as I thought about how I felt and how my body responded to this new and unfamiliar environment, I came to realise that my body and emotions were telling me that I was afraid. And even though I had no need to fear for my physical safety, I really saw that the different skin colours, different faiths, different cultures and different languages were unsettling me, and I was feeling afraid. Because what I had unwittingly uncovered was a previously unconscious bias, this one being a racial bias. So bias is the first side of the pyramid of authentic leadership. So what is bias? Simply put, bias is the tendency to privilege a particular group of people or a set of ideas to the exclusion of others. Biases form unconsciously in our formative years and in childhood via input from our families, our faith groups, sporting club, the media, and lots of other external sources. Bias shapes how we see ourselves, how we see other people, how we see the world, and it informs the decisions that we make and the relationships we have. It informs how we treat others, who we innately show respect for, and who we unconsciously dismiss. Put simply, bias is part of the way we all think. Those thoughts that come so quickly to us, that sense of those quick thoughts that come when we see somebody, like that sense of threat I had around people who were different to me. That's what Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman calls fast thinking. Ideas and thoughts that quickly spring to mind. They're quite different to the slow thinking that we use to give a considered response to a situation where we take a step back and respond rather than react. Roger J. Davies, who's an expert in linguistics, calls this fast thinking our biases, a parallel world that operates at the same time as our more rational and logical thought. This idea of a parallel world really intrigues me. So our biases are there, just under the surface, and they influence the logical and rational thought processes on which we pride ourselves. I think it's helpful to have this idea of a parallel worlds that coexist so that we can understand these two quite different ways of thinking that we all employ. And it's important that we accept that we think and make decisions in two parallel universes, ones that exist and operate simultaneously. Because then we're more aware of how our biases can impact our decision making and we're less likely to make flawed decisions. Davies goes on to say that recent research shows that unconscious bias is in play in every aspect of the modern workplace, in recruitment, retention, performance management, promotion, client relations, and the allocation of work assignments. Siegel Barsad, who was a management professor at the University of Pennsylvania until her death a couple of years ago, says you can be the most consciously unbiased and progressive thinker and still have unconscious biases that come from our culture and the things you experienced as a child. And they don't necessarily align with your beliefs. This is a key thing to understand about our ways of thinking. We all have values and beliefs by which we order our lives, and we have biases that sit below our conscious thought. Both systems operate simultaneously. Having a strong set of values doesn't safeguard you from having biases and being influenced by them. Having biases, whether you're aware of them or not, doesn't signify that you're unprincipled or lacking in values and ethics. I can hear you. You're thinking, so how can bias be a leadership strength? Well, while bias can be seen purely in a negative light, seen as a weakness to avoid, deny, bury, or ignore, we can choose to see it in a different way. We can choose to see it as a data point for growth and change. As we grow in awareness and acceptance of our biases and the impact that they have on our relationships and the decisions that we make, then we can mitigate the risk of that impact. Growing up in my white, middle-class, conservative Christian family, although we weren't overtly racist, and I would have said I didn't have a racist bone in my body, somewhere along the line I learned that difference was a threat. And then my experiences of working with so many different nationalities on Nauru made me confront this way of thinking, this bias, and I flipped that difference is a threat to difference is an asset. A strategy that will work to help us to identify the unconscious biases that we might be experiencing. And the very first step is to notice the cues in our body. Remember, I talked about how when I was first in that situation on Naru, my stomach was churning, my shoulders were tensing. Sometimes it can be a weight on your chest. So your body can physically be sending you messages that your brain hasn't yet caught up with. In the same way, you may be experiencing some emotional cues, some emotional triggers. And so things like feeling uncertain, feeling afraid, perhaps, maybe even frustrated or angry. So listen to these cues, because we don't get all the information we need just through our brain. We don't sort it all out through there. Our bodies and our emotions are really good places where we need to listen for the cues that something is going on that we need to pay attention to. The second step is to ask yourself some questions. Observe what has just happened. Is it something that someone said? Are you finding yourself in a situation that is unfamiliar to you? Or is this a regular situation and you are starting to regularly feel this way in this situation or around a particular person? So start to ask yourself some questions. Why am I feeling like this? What has just happened? Does this happen all the time, or is this in a specific situation? Questions are key when it comes to working with our biases. The third part of the process of identifying our biases is to look for the narratives, the stories in our lives. I had to think about difference. What did I learn about difference as a child? What were the stories, the belief systems that I had about difference? And I realized that not overtly, but quite subtly, I'd been taught that people who were different to me were not safe, they couldn't be trusted, they were perhaps even a threat. So start to think about the stories and narratives in your lives. What are the things that you've always believed that now is a good time to question? Are those narratives really helpful? Have they contributed to you feeling uncomfortable in this situation? So think about the narratives, identify them. The very last step in identifying our biases is actually giving a name to them. And it's so important that we are brave enough, courageous enough to name our biases. I've had to name that I have a racist bias, and I don't like that. It's confronting. However, I have to recognize that it's there, and once I've recognized it, I can actually do something about it. So that's where it's key to actually give a name to a bias. Even if you don't like what you found out, be brave enough to own it, because it's what we can name that we can actually do something with. While we continue to deny and suppress and ignore, we cannot change the things that we actually want to change in our lives. So identify the bias, give it a name. So bias is the first side of the pyramid of authentic leadership. Now, the second side I've observed has been felt keenly whenever bias is raised, and that's the emotion of shame. I felt ashamed of myself when I realised that I had a latent racist bias, a bias that didn't actually fit with how I saw myself as being open and welcoming, of valuing connection and inclusion. Of course, the authority on shame is the marvellous Bron, and she defines shame as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing we are flawed and therefore unworthy of acceptance and belonging. Shame tells us that we have failed so badly that we're not worth loving. Psychotherapist Dr. Joseph Burgo views shame not merely as one single emotion, but rather a whole family of emotions, which includes embarrassment, humiliation, disgrace. Further, he understands shame as having been developed in order to keep communities connected, to ensure survival and growth continue both corporately and individually. So there's a sense in which shame is an aspect of being in community, of maintaining relationships, even of our keeping ourselves and others in line within prescribed boundaries of acceptable behaviour. Now, this acceptable behaviour is not just about the big things like murder, theft and adultery. Bron shares one of her shame stories in her book, I Thought It Was Just Me. She recalls a time when, as a mum, her children at school were asked to bring in some baked goods for a bake sale, for a cake stall. And the accepted norm was that parents, aka mothers, would provide some home-baked, home-cooked cakes or biscuits or cookies. Through a series of events, whether it was lack of time, just being a super busy person, or, that note got lost in the bottom of the bag, Brené had to send in some shop-bought cakes. She recalls this sense of complete failure as a mother, that feeling that she'd broken an unwritten mother code. She was a bad mother for not having sent in some homemade cookies. She felt ashamed. Well, much like bias, shame is usually relegated to the don't talk about that bin. Shame is seen as purely negative, something to avoid, to hide from. And shame does make us want to hide ourselves from ourselves and also hide ourselves from others, so that we can ignore our perceived failure and others don't see how we failed to live up to the standard that has been set. But how can shame be a powerful ally as leaders? Shame is an indicator that we have breached a value that we hold dear. It might be a societal or a community value, like the one Brené talks about. It may be a personal value, like my value of connection that was broken by my feeling threatened by people who are different to me. When we've had that feeling of shame, we then have the opportunity to reflect on what has recently happened and see whether a value or which value has been breached. This then gives us the chance to decide whether that value is one we want to continue to keep holding or whether we can let it go. And if we continue to feel shame for a breached value that we no longer hold, we can retrain our thinking so we can make decisions in freedom. In Brené's case, the community value of home-baked goodies for the cake stall is unrealistic and unsustainable for a busy woman. Let that value go. Refuse to be ashamed for an outdated value that seeks to limit people to a particular set of behaviours or a particular narrative. Further, as we explore our values, we may decide that the value that was breached is important to us, and perhaps, like me, you discover that there's a bias lurking beneath the surface that needs to be unearthed, identified and owned. In this way, shame is like a scalpel, cutting away the layers of self-deceit and allowing us to see what lies beneath. We may not like what we find. I certainly didn't. But once we've seen what the bias is, we can choose what we do with it. We can write a new narrative, as I did, around difference. Well, now we have two sides to our pyramid of authentic leadership. The third side is vulnerability. Let me start by saying what vulnerability is not. Vulnerability is not sharing all our deepest, darkest secrets with our teams. It's not allowing our emotions to have full sway in any and every situation. Vulnerability is not letting someone have it when you're angry with them. Vulnerability involves being aware of our emotions, having ownership of the narratives in our lives, and sharing what is appropriate for the time and the people involved. There's been many times when I've been applauded for my vulnerability as I've shared my story, but it's part of the story that I'm comfortable with sharing. I don't share parts of my story that are still in the process of healing, or that it's not helpful or useful to share at that particular time or with those particular people. I can share my story of unearthing my bias, my racist bias, because I've actually owned that part of my story. And now there's no shame attached to it that makes me want to hide that part of me from others. But there's another aspect of vulnerability that speaks to authenticity. That's the vulnerability I felt when I sat down with Fatima on Nauru and asked her about what I'd been observing of the attitudes of white people to the Nauruans. I had to own my part in those attitudes, and when she confirmed that her team accepted how we were behaving towards them, I did feel shame. I didn't like the person Fatima was reflecting back to me, particularly because that person was violating my value of connection. Feeling superior towards another person doesn't allow room for real connection. And connection is one of my core values. And so I needed to do something about that. I know I don't always recognise my white privilege because it's as natural to me as breathing. But I do try to see it in myself and others and call it out and address it where I can. But why is vulnerability a key strength for women who lead? One thing that women do really well, quite naturally, is to collaborate, to make connections and to build relationships. And nothing builds connection faster than feeling as though another person gets you, that another person has been where you are and grown, survived, thrived, that another person has gone ahead of you and cleared the path. Authentic vulnerability allows a leader to share aspects of their work and personal journey that enables others to relate more fully or more deeply. In this way, relationships are strengthened. Such connections are especially necessary when you, as a leader, are trying to take others to a new place, one you know they can get to, but which is new or uncomfortable for them. Displaying genuine and authentic vulnerability gives your team confidence in you that if they follow you, they will be safe, that together the goals that you're laying out can be achieved. The very thing that gives us confidence to be vulnerable is that we know clearly what our values are. We lay them as the foundation of all that we do. We stand on them, which brings us to the foundation of this pyramid, our values. Values can be defined as the regard that something is held to deserve, the importance, worth, or usefulness of something. They can also be seen as principles or standards of behaviour by which we judge what is important in life. My three core values are courage, creativity, and connection. In her 2018 article in Psychology Today, Meg Selig suggests that there's a number of ways in which you can identify your values. We can find lists of values quite readily on the net, so from whichever list you choose, find the 6 that seem the most important to you. Don't second guess yourself, choose the ones that just seem right to you. Another method is to think of 3 to 6 people that you admire or love. Maybe they're in your friendship group, in your workplace, in your family. Think about why they're so important to you. What values do these people display that resonate with you? Make a note of them. Who do you admire and respect at work? Why? What qualities do they display that you want to emulate? We often are drawn to people whose personal values are the same as our own, even when we don't consciously make note of them. Do your friends share a particular value? That could be why they're in your friendship group, because they share similar values to you. And a third way is just to observe ourselves. Take note and learn what is deeply important to you. Where do you find yourself getting upset, frustrated, angry? Is it because a personal value has been violated? I know you can also buy sets of cards that have got values on them, and they've got pictures. So if you are a more visually orientated learner or a visually orientated person, maybe that set of images will be easier than the printed words. When we've identified our top 6 values, then try to narrow it down to 3. I've said before, I've got 3 core values: courage, creativity, and connection. And I return to those values time and time again, but especially when my life feels a little bit out of sync. And it's then that I often discover that one of those values is not being honoured. Staying true to our values can be challenging when the expectations of others at home or in the workplace can conflict with our personal values. It's then that we have to decide how to respond. Am I being asked to compromise a personal value just once, or is this an ongoing situation where perhaps workplace values clash with my personal values? What will I do then? Can I respectfully question or challenge how things are done so that I don't have to compromise what's important to me? The pyramid of authentic leadership is a powerful representation of the 4 key aspects of leadership which are key for women who know deep in their soul that there's another way to live. They know that when they understand what unconsciously drives their decision making and impacts their relationships, they can intentionally address the biases that are uncovered and choose what to do with them. Rather than hiding from shame, women can see it as an essential tool for identifying the values that have been inadvertently breached and then examine them, determine which values are useful to continue with and which must be let loose. Women who lead recognise the power of authentic vulnerability, knowing when and where to share parts of their story to encourage and support and build up their teams. And women stand firmly on the values that provide a foundation for their lives, enabling them to live up to the fullest potential and operate out of the power that is uniquely theirs. As women embrace the powerful truth that what has been deemed weakness is actually powerful strength, they can together create the worlds they've been dreaming of. The pyramid of authentic leadership is a powerful representation of the 4 key aspects of leadership which are key for women who know deep in their soul that there's another way to live. They know that when they understand what unconsciously drives their decision making and impacts their relationships, they can intentionally address the biases that are uncovered and choose what to do with them. Rather than hiding from shame, women can see it as an essential tool for identifying the values that have been inadvertently breached and then examine them, determine which values are useful to continue with and which must be let loose. Women who lead recognise the power of authentic vulnerability, knowing when and where to share parts of their story to encourage and support and build up their teams. And women stand firmly on the values that provide a foundation for their lives, enabling them to live up to the fullest potential and operate out of the power that is uniquely theirs. As women embrace the powerful truth that what has been deemed weakness is actually powerful strength, they can together create the worlds they've been dreaming of.